Power doesn't always have a face. Sometimes it has a laugh. A very particular kind of laugh. Loud, unapologetic, the kind that fills a room and makes everyone else feel like they're already invited to a party they didn't know was happening. Imagine this. A yacht cutting through dark water somewhere in the Mediterranean. On the deck, there are powerful men, senators, scientists, royalty, billionaires, and moving between them, effortless, radiant, translating one world into another. There's a woman in her 30s, her early 30s. She speaks 5 languages. She knows which wine to order without looking at the list. She knows who everyone is before she even enters the room. And more importantly, she knows what everyone wants. See, she's been trained for this for her entire life. Not at school, not in a boardroom, but in the lap of a man who once owned everything. Her father. She is Ghislaine Maxwell. And for decades, she was the most dangerous woman in any room she walked into. Not because of what she carried in her hands, but because of what she carried in her mind. The belief that access to power was the same as power itself, and the willingness to do anything to keep that access, anything. Welcome to GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, and you're listening to GBRLIFE of Crimes, where we explore not just what happened in crimes committed by women, but why they happened and the psychology behind them. Today, we're telling the story of Ghislaine Maxwell, a story about privilege and psychology, about the hunger for relevance, about the way some people weaponize charm so completely that by the time you realize what's happening, you're already inside the story they wrote for you. This one's going to be heavy. There are real victims attached to this story, real women and girls who were hurt in ways that cannot be undone. We won't name them here unless they've chosen to name themselves publicly. This episode is not about them. It's about Ghislaine, and about the mind that decided people were currency, and about how Ghislaine got there, and about the question we ask every time we hear of the crimes. Why? To understand Ghislaine Maxwell, you have to understand Robert Maxwell. Because without Robert, there is no Ghislaine. Not as we know her. Robert Maxwell was a man built from catastrophe and reinvention. Born in 1923 in a tiny village in what is now the Czech Republic. Jewish, desperately poor, and the son of subsistence farmers. He watched his parents and most of his siblings die in the Holocaust, but he survived. He escaped into the British Army, renamed himself Robert Maxwell, and then he spent the rest of his life running as fast and as far from that boy in that village as he possibly could. By the time Ghislaine was born in 1961, the 9th child of Robert and his French wife Betty, Robert Maxwell had already transformed himself into a publishing magnate, a media mogul, and a member of parliament. He was enormous in every sense of the word. Physically, emotionally, financially, he dominated every room, every conversation, every relationship he walked into. But he was also a bully, a fraudster, and a profound controlling man whose charm was so overwhelming that people often confused it for love. But Ghislaine, there was no confusion in that he had a favorite, and it was Ghislaine. She was the youngest daughter named after her brother, Ghislaine, who had died in a car accident 7 years before her birth. So the naming was not incidental. It carried something. A kind of replacement. A project. A living continuation of grief. From the very beginning, Ghislaine Maxwell's identity was built on the needs of someone else. Robert called her his favorite, openly. He flew her on helicopters to school. He built her confidence with the kind of total, unconditional regard that most children never receive, but many children crave. But here's the thing about that kind of love. When it comes from a man like Robert Maxwell, it wasn't selfless love. It was possessive love. the love of a collector for the most prized item in his collection, and it came with an unspoken condition. You're perfect because I say so, which means your value is contingent entirely on my continued approval. Psychologists have a name for what happens to children raised by narcissistic parents, because that's what that is. They become extensions, not autonomous people. They're satellites orbiting a much larger mass. The satellite has no orbit of its own. It doesn't need to develop one because the gravitational pull of the parent is so total. So the child learns to shine in borrowed light, to feel significant through proximity rather than self, to define themselves not by who they are, but by who they belong to. That was Ghislaine, and she had no idea, because from the inside, it feels like love. It feels like you were simply born exceptional. It never occurs to you that the exception is borrowed. The Maxwell household was not a warm place, and it never is when your parent is a narcissist. So it's to no surprise to know that Robert was domineering to the point of emotional cruelty, especially with his other children. He would publicly humiliate them at the dinner table, making approval something they had to earn daily, and never quite manage to keep. Betty, a scholar and dignified woman, his wife, coped through emotional distance, retreating into her own world. Several of Maxwell's children struggled deeply into adulthood. Two of Ghislaine's brothers later went to trial themselves over financial crimes following their father's death. The Maxwell family was, by psychological measure, a system of damage passed quietly from one generation to the next, underneath the gleaming surface of immense privilege. But for Ghislaine, shielded by her father's favoritism, the damage wore a different costume. It didn't look like neglect. It looked like confidence. It looked like sophistication. It looked like a girl who had everything, who traveled the world, who skied in Switzerland, who sat at tables with heads of state. And she did. She had all of those things. What she didn't have was a self that existed without him. Ghislaine attended Headington School in Oxford, where she was, by all accounts, vivid, magnetic, the kind of teenager who commanded a room without trying. Classmates remember her as fiercely funny, intensely social, someone who seemed to exist on a slightly higher frequency than everyone else. She wasn't just popular. She was orchestrating. Even then, there are accounts of her using information socially, of understanding the architecture of a group and knowing exactly where to position herself within it. She studied, later on, at Balliol College in Oxford, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, and she excelled, not just academically, but as you know, and of course, socially. She joined the right clubs. She knew the right people. She understood before most of her peers that in certain circles, access was the ultimate currency, and that if you could be the person who opened doors, you would never lack for relevance. But let's look at what was happening beneath all that shine, because that's where the psychology lives. Adolescence is when we begin the developmental work of separating from our parents. So this is a big moment. Normally, we push back, we question, we become individuals, yet still attached to our parents in a different way. And for most teenagers, this is turbulent, but it is necessary, because it's the psychological task of becoming a separate person. Ghislaine never completed that task, because in order to separate from Robert, even emotionally, would have been to lose the source of her entire sense of worth. So instead of pulling away, she did the opposite. She absorbed him. She adopted his values, his relationship with power, his belief that rules were for lesser people, his comfort with using people as means to an ends. She didn't rebel against her father. She instead became him. And what she became was extraordinary in scope and in a sense terrifying in implication. There's something else important happening during these years that I don't want to gloss over. Ghislaine was watching her entire childhood and adolescence how a man like her father wielded power over the people around him, including women. She grew up in a world where men like Robert were admired, not held accountable, where their appetites were indulged, where the women around them adapted, accommodated, and served, or disappeared from the circle entirely. Ghislaine watched that dynamic her entire life, and she took a specific lesson from it. Not that it was wrong, not that those women deserved better, but that the way to survive in that world was to be the woman who was useful, not the one who got used, to be the one who had the proximity to the man at the center, because that she learned from birth, and that was the only power worth having. After Oxford, Ghislaine moved into her father's orbit professionally. She became the managing director of his football club, Oxford United, and she traveled in the highest echelons of British society, attending events with royalty and politicians, known in every room as Robert Maxwell's daughter. And she was brilliant at it, at navigating, at reading, at being exactly what the room needed. But underneath that, there were fractures forming that she couldn't see. Robert was not the empire he appeared to be. He had spent years quietly looting the pension funds from his own employees. Thousands of working-class people whose retirement security he stole to prop up his collapsing business interests. He was a man who had rebuilt himself from nothing and was terrified, always of returning to nothing. So he stole, and he lied, and he controlled. And then, in November of 1991, Robert fell from his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, which he had named after her, and he fell into the Atlantic Ocean off the Canary Islands. But here's the thing, whether he jumped, fell, or was helped is a question that has never been definitively answered. What was answered in the weeks that followed was the state of his empire. It was gone, which means all of his frauds were exposed. The Maxwell name, which had been Ghislaine's armor and identity for 30 years, had become a scandal overnight. And overnight, Ghislaine didn't just lose her father. She now lost herself. And I want to stay here for a moment because this is the most psychologically important event in this entire story. Ghislaine was 30 years old when her father died. She had spent her entire life as his satellite. She had never needed to build an independent identity because his gravity had always provided one. And then that gravity simply ceased to exist. Now she's left in the void. No orbit. No borrowed light. No Robert Maxwell to reflect. Just Ghislaine. And Ghislaine without her father was terrified. That terror does not excuse what came next, but it does explain the velocity with which she reached for the first man who offered her a replacement, Jeffrey Epstein. They met in the early 1990s. Exactly how is a matter of some dispute. What is not in dispute is what happened next. He became her world. He provided the private jets, the mansions, the social access, the circle of powerful men, everything her father's world had once provided. And she, in return, provided something equally valuable to him. She provided legitimacy, charm, the social infrastructure that turned his gatherings into events that people of consequence would actually attend. She was his fixer, his companion, his social architect. And according to prosecutors and survivors and ultimately a federal jury, she was also something else. She was his recruiter, his groomer, his access to girls, young girls, some as young as it can get. So young, I don't even want to say. And I want to be careful here, but I also want to be honest, because this part of the story is where the truth is not comfortable. What the evidence showed, what witnesses testified to, and what a jury ultimately believed is that Ghislaine Maxwell was not a passive bystander. She was active. She identified girls. She approached them, sometimes in parks and shopping malls, at bus stops. She was warm. She was interested. She was exactly the kind of sophisticated, worldly older woman that a teenager or child would feel drawn to, especially if that child or teenager felt unseen, and she used that warmth deliberately. She asked about their lives, their families, their troubles. She created trust, and then she used that trust as a mechanism of delivery. She normalized what was happening. She was present. Sometimes she participated in the actual abuse. And when girls show confusion or resistance or distress, it was Ghislaine who managed them, who reframed it, who told them that, no, this is normal, and this is an opportunity. Ghislaine used every social and psychological tool at her disposal to keep the machinery running smoothly. And that is perhaps the most important thing to sit with. Not just what she did, but how she did it. Ghislaine Maxwell did not groom these girls with threats of force. She groomed them with warmth and access and the intoxicating sense that they had been chosen by someone who mattered. She used exactly the same tools that had been used on her. The sense that your values come from proximity to powerful people. The sense that being chosen is the same as being loved. She had absorbed that lesson so completely in her childhood that she deployed it without any recognition of what she was actually doing. And that is not an excuse, but it is psychologically a reckoning. There is a concept in trauma psychology called repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to reenact unresolved psychological patterns. Sometimes people do this hoping for a different outcome. Sometimes they do it because it's the only rational template they've ever really known. Women who groom other women and girls for abusive men share a documented profile. Women who learn early that their worth was contingent on the approval of a powerful man, who learned that proximity was protection, who were never given the belief that they had value outside of what could have been provided by someone else, who in serving the appetite of the man they were attached to, were simultaneously trying to secure their own place. Ghislaine Maxwell fits that profile with a precision that is almost clinical in its completeness. And that understanding does not make what she did forgivable. The girls and boys she targeted were children. They were real people whose lives were altered in ways that lasted far beyond the events themselves. Understanding the psychology of the person who hurt them is not about generating sympathy. It's about understanding how this happens. It's about recognizing the machinery. Because if we can look clearly at the machinery, next time we can stop the machine from running. For years, decades even, Maxwell operated without consequence. Epstein had his first serious brush with law enforcement in 2005, when a mother in Palm Beach reported that her daughter had been abused. The investigation that followed implicated not just Epstein, but Ghislaine. And yet, in 2008, Epstein received what is widely regarded as one of the most controversial plea deals in modern legal history. A non-prosecution agreement that shielded him and reportedly his associates from federal charges. He served 13 months in county jail with work release for much of that time, and Ghislaine wasn't even charged. She continued. She moved in the same social circles. She attended events. She was photographed and lived publicly. She appeared to believe, and perhaps there was a reason to believe, that the protection would hold, that the axis had cultivated across a lifetime in the world's most powerful rooms and would insulate her forever. She had always been the favorite, and she had always been protected. But in July of 2019, Jeffrey was arrested again federal prosecutors in New York filed trafficking charges. Ghislaine understood immediately what was happening. So when Epstein died in his cell in August of 2019 and his death ruled a suicide, Ghislaine appeared to believe that without Epstein as a central defendant, the case against her might collapse. So she went into hiding. She moved between properties. She avoided being photographed. And she reportedly paid cash for a property in New Hampshire and tried to obscure the purchase. But she was found there in July of 2020 and arrested by the FBI. Her trial began in November of 2021 in federal courts in Manhattan, and it was extraordinary in what was presented. Survivors testified in careful, controlled, devastating detail. They described what had happened to them, and they described Ghislaine's role, not as a bystander, as the woman who made them feel comfortable before making them vulnerable, as the one who sometimes participated directly, as the one who laughed, who was casual about it, who treated their suffering as ordinary background noise of an ordinary afternoon. The defense argued that Ghislaine was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes, that she was a convenient target for public anger in the absence of the man who had held the most power. It's a theory that has its defenders. And there may be truth to the argument that in a more just world, more people would have been held accountable for what happened. But the argument that she was merely a scapegoat cannot survive a clear-eyed look at the evidence. She was clearly not innocent when she was prosecuted, just because someone more guilty had already died. The jury considered the evidence carefully, and they came to the conclusion that we all know. She was found guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including the most serious, trafficking of a child. On June 28, 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, federal prison, and she's currently serving that sentence, with an expected release date in 2037, when she will be 75 years old. Funny thing is, she continues to say she's innocent in any appeals or interviews conducted from prison, that she was wrongly convicted, that she was failed by her legal team. She has shown no public acknowledgement of harm to the people who testified against her. This woman, who spent her life reading rooms and managing perceptions, has applied those same tools to her own narratives and practiced consistency, even from federal prison. So let's sit with the full psychological picture, because it's complicated, and it's not comfortable, and it doesn't resolve neatly in either direction. Ghislaine Maxwell was shaped by a narcissistic father who gave her identity built entirely on proximity, the proximity to power, rather than any authentic sense of self. She grew up in a household where love was demonstrated through control and approval was conditional on performance. But she lost that father violently and publicly when she was 30 years old, before she ever had a chance to develop any sense of self that could exist without him. And then she immediately transferred that codependency onto Jeffrey Epstein. And in doing so, she became complicit and an active participant in the abuse. That very trajectory has a psychological coherence that is worth sitting with, even if doing so is deeply uncomfortable. There's a question that also deserves to be raised, not answered, because I don't think it can be answered, and that's about what Ghislaine herself experienced in the relationship with Epstein. And this is not an attempt to reframe her as a victim in any way, because that diminishes the survivors of the crimes that she helped commit. Those women and girls deserve protection, and she did not give it to them. Full stop. But controlling, coercive environments have documented psychological effects on the people inside them. The line between participant and captive is sometimes more complex than we're really comfortable admitting, particularly when someone has been psychologically primed from childhood to seek their identity and safety through attachment to a powerful, controlling man. We may never know the full extent of that relationship, but what we do know is the outcome. And that outcome was clear harm. And what can be observed from the outside and from the evidence of her behavior, statements, and demeanor throughout the trial, are patterns that align with certain psychological profiles. A profound difficulty with empathy for people outside her immediate circle. A sense of entitlement and specialness that operated as a persistent framework. A lack of visible remorse that has persisted, even in the face of devastating consequences. These are recognizable behaviors. What they represent clinically, if anything, is not for us to diagnose from the outside. But here's what I keep returning to. The most dangerous enablers are never the ones who are obviously and visibly malicious. They are the ones who have built a psychological world in which their doing has been basically reframed as protection, as opportunity, as simply how the world works. That they may genuinely not experience it as harm. Ghislaine was brilliant in how she was perceptive. She could read a room with extraordinary precision, and yet she appears to have been unable to look at a teenager and recognize that the machinery that she was running was destroying something real. She saw their faces. She saw their fear. She saw what was happening to these kids, and she was unable to see what she was doing, or at least she was unable to actually care. So was that something she was born with, or simply made into? And if she was made into it, did she choose it? There is no real way to know the answer to any of that. And I think anyone who tells you that they know for certain is probably not being honest with you. What I do know is that the question is worth asking, because in the ask, we get closer to seeing what that machinery is. And in seeing the machinery, we get closer to the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility of stopping it somewhere, in someone, before it runs. Because seeing yourself requires a self to see. And Ghislaine's self was always borrowed, always orbiting someone else's mass. Always at the core, still that girl on a yacht named after her, waiting for her father to tell her who she was. It was basically power by proximity. That was her whole story. And in the end, the proximity ran out time and time again. And now she's just a woman in a prison cell, or a nicely padded prison cell, who still believes that she's exceptional, who still cannot understand why the rules applied to her after all, and who will spend 20 years sitting with a question she may never be willing to answer. But as we all know, evil doesn't announce itself. It rarely screams. Sometimes it's a yacht in the Mediterranean with a warm smile at a bus stop and a woman who knows exactly what you need to hear. Sometimes it's the most dangerous person in the room, but that person has spent their entire life learning how to make you feel safe. That's why they're so dangerous. And sometimes the most tragic part is that they were once a child themselves, wanting to feel safe too, and nobody came. So they did it to others, other children. And that alone makes them the biggest, most disgusting monster of all. This has been GBRLIFE of Crimes, part of GBRLIFE Transmissions, and I'm Caitlin, reminding you that understanding the darkness helps us appreciate the light. Join me next time as we uncover another case that challenges everything we thought we knew about the criminal mind.